It's been a few months since we've said this, but we're finally back. Well, at least for a couple of weeks before Studio Gaga decides it needs a hiatus again. But Chapter 383 is one of the most unique chapters in Berserk because it has the least amount of dialogue out of any other chapter in the series. That makes sense, because most of it focuses on Guts grappling with what's waiting for him within a single dark room. But if you know anything about Berserk, then you know that words aren't an elegant form of expression. This is a world where blood and blades do all the talking for you. And at the end of the latest chapter, Guts seems to have been swallowed whole by one of those things. But which one was it? Well, that's why we're here, aren't we? So, without further ado, let's dive straight into Berserk Chapter 383, Explain. Before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. The Black Swordsman and His Darkness. Chapter 383 picks up shortly after the ending of Chapter 382, which was one of the more depressing things we have read in recent memory. Guts, the man who once fought 100 knights on a whim, the man who has slain several enemies much larger and stronger than him, the man who's orchestrated more prison breaks than Michael Schofield, is now willingly submitting to capture and execution. The color page introducing the chapter shows Guts in chains, being held down by iron spikes that bind him from all directions. This is the cover for Volume 43, which went on sale only recently, and there are a couple of interesting things to note here. The first is the fact that Guts' face looks more determined than it does tortured. Now, maybe that's just a visual representation of his generally stoic nature, because we've seen this face many times throughout the series. Even when he gets tortured, Guts doesn't show emotion because he knows that emotions are a weakness in such situations and represent the death of duty. It's quite ironic considering his current condition, but let's talk about the second thing before we come back to the irony. The light that is bathing him in the Volume 43 cover is completely blue. Now, blue is not a color that has been used in this manner in any of Berserk's colored pages. Guts is mostly portrayed with red, black, or white backgrounds because those colors better reflect his rage-filled mental state. This blue light is a lot more tranquil, more illuminating, and if you ask us, it shows a shift in his mentality and allegiance. As the Black Swordsman, Guts was a demonic, demon-killing machine, focused only on taking the lives of those who have wronged him and not caring about anything else. But since he joined up with folks like Farnese, Serpico, and Shirka, that side of him has been slowly fading into the background as the Guts of old takes control of his psyche. Before his mental breakdown in Chapter 373, Guts was actually doing a lot better than he had in years. Physically, he might have been a wreck, but mentally and emotionally, he had improved quite a bit, as evidenced by him willingly taking on companions. So, if you ask us, this moonlight-looking spotlight that's being shown on him is a sign of his next transformation, which we will also touch upon in a few moments. But the text accompanying the color page is probably as long as the dialogue within this chapter and just as important, because it tells us that yes, Guts did give up on himself when Rakshas came for his life, and it interestingly refers to his imprisonment within the Kushan Stupa as an interment. Interment is the act of placing a corpse within its grave or tomb, which is typically accompanied with funerary rites. By referring to Guts' imprisonment as him being interred within the stupa, the writers are telling us one thing quite clearly, that this man in front of us is no longer a living human being. And that makes sense if you just review everything that has happened since Griffith kidnapped Casca from Elfhelm. Guts has not spoken a single word since that fateful day, instead choosing the solitude of defeat within his own mind. He had an internal exchange with his Beast of Darkness, where the beast told him he needed to give up all that he held dear, including his very soul, in order to defeat Griffith, and whether this was intentional or not, we never quite hear Guts' answer to its assertion. Since then, he's been in his fugue-like state, where he seems to be unsure of what's around him and what's happening to him, with his only moment of clarity being the one where he nearly allowed Rakshas to kill him. Without a will to live and things to live for, a man might as well be a walking corpse. And from that perspective, Chapter 382 showed us Guts' funeral procession. He was led by a massive guard composed of Kushan troops, priests, Daiba, Silat, and Isidro, with Puck's final plea to him before the stupa gates closed, being a cry that falls on deaf ears. And that corpse motif, at least, is carried forward quite seamlessly into Chapter 383, where Guts appears to be more dazed and confused than ever before. One reason for that is him having lost his brazen fighting spirit, but another reason is that he's standing in a pitch-black chamber. The manga art shows us what's inside the stupa because it has has to. We're the readers after all. But Guts' actual sight and most other senses have been cut off entirely by the darkness of the stupa's interior. To illustrate that fact, the first page shows us Guts from the viewpoint of the stupa's floor, and then the second page cuts to Guts' POV, which depicts pure darkness. In this moment, he's completely enveloped by the darkness that permeates his life, and we think it's the most fitting visual metaphor we've seen in Berserk in quite a while. His mind and heart were already besieged by this emotion, but now that it's his physical environment as well, Guts and his darkness are truly one and the same. He puts out his one good hand in front of him to try and navigate the space as he strides through it, which causes him to fall immediately. But the lack of light isn't the only reason for that. Turns out, in the middle of this enclosed space is a pool of water with a gigantic lotus leaf sitting on its surface. Guts can't see it, but the moment he feels it, Guts' despair deepens somehow. He tries to rise up and sit with his knees folded underneath him, but he just can't do it. Something makes him sway and fall on his back, and as he faces the ceiling of the stupa, the lotus leaf appears to be opening up underneath him. We might have complained about the lack of dialogue in this chapter a lot more if the art wasn't so good, because the way Studio Gaga has drawn the leaf makes it appear like a veiny patch of flesh instead. When you factor that into the outline of the leaf, which vaguely resembles two hands clasped together, it really paints a picture that lines up with the term internment. Guts has been placed within the tomb that will either break him or make him anew, and it appears as though this was the true purpose behind taking him to the stupa in the first place. Because as he struggles to get a hold of his bearings, the scene shifts outside, and we see the man responsible for his imprisonment still hanging around his proverbial cell. What is Daiba's true motive? The world has gone from light to darkness between chapters 382 and 383 because the moon has replaced the sun and the stars have come out in full force. As clouds gather overhead, we see two men watching the stupa with rapt attention. No points for guessing who they are because those men are Daiba and Salat, but the fact that they've stuck around after most of their party has departed, including Isidro and Puck, is quite curious. The fact that it's no longer day means that several hours have passed since Guts entered the stupa, so the only reason Salat and Daiba have to remain in its vicinity is to observe the results of his interment. We see Daiba floating in what appears to be an approximation of a setsumatsusha, which is the Japanese word for auxiliary and branch shrines that surround a larger one. These shrines are smaller in size and structure and are said to house the spirits of gods affiliated with the primary shrines. They can be as small as a beehive or large enough to house a person within them, though usually setsumatsusha are covered structures. This one feels like an open pagoda meant for meditation, which explains why Daiba was just floating around in it as Salat observed the stupa. There is another connotation to this, however, which is that as a conduit for the divine, Daiba was the only one allowed to enter this smaller shrine. When he was introduced to the series, Daiba immediately recognized Guts and Serpico's magical fetishes as blessings bestowed upon them by gods and goddesses associated with his own religion. He called Guts the Kshatriya of Durga and Serpico the Kshatriya of Vayu. He was shocked to find such spiritual warriors in a land filled with heathens, but he dismissed that notion because he was confident his devotion outweighed theirs. Daiba claimed that he prayed to Durga and Vayu every morning and evening, and that might feel like a one-off piece of villainous exposition, but it's looking more and more likely that that was the truth. At the end of the day, Daiba has many questionable means and motives, but his devotion to his gods is as real gets. In ancient India, Brahmins were considered to be spiritual conduits that enabled human connection to the gods, which is why they were the only ones allowed to conduct prayer, rituals, and of course, funeral rites. Him floating and meditating within this smaller shrine could be a sign of his purity, which we feel weird mentioning because he's done some seriously dark things throughout the series. But the exchange he has with Salat only further reinforces that idea. The Bakiraka prince is standing outside the meditation shrine with his eyes fixed on the stupa as though he's waiting for something to happen. After a while, he breaks his silence and tells Daiba that things are way too quiet for his liking. Salat feels as though this is the calm before a terrible storm, where the stupa will become its eye and swallow everything in its path. And so he asks the Paramarishi Senani what's going on inside. Daiba's answer is as confusing as it is intriguing, because instead of giving Salat an answer, he says that he's asked a good question. When the Bakiraka prince asks him to elaborate, Daiba explains that the stupa is a site which has two levels of of existence. Its exterior, which they can see and perceive, exists within the physical world, but its interior is completely cut off from the physical world, and not even his magic can do anything to pierce through the veil that separates them. This can only mean one thing in Berserk terminology, that Guts is currently somewhere within the astral world. This will make a whole lot of sense when we get to the next section, because for now, we want to focus on the exchange between these Kushan folk. Daiba goes on to say that while the stupa's interior and exterior might be disconnected, it doesn't change the fact that inside is a void. And then he makes a statement that seems to display his true motivation. He says that he's here to see what kind of madness comes out of that darkness, and Scylla tells him to start making sense soon. Daiba retorts and says he's the one spouting nonsense, because when confronted with a darkness that cuts off all external senses, man has only one choice remaining to him, and that is to gaze inward. Self-reflection is not the claim we were expecting Daiba to make when it comes to the reason behind him throwing Guts into this prison at the end of the world, but it does make a disturbing amount of sense. His entire life, Guts has run away from introspection. As a child, he kept moving from battlefield to battlefield, not because he was thinking about his personal strength and life goals, but because he wasn't doing that. Then when he became a falcon, he started to think about what he wanted from life more and more, until the Eclipse seemingly made his decision for him. As the Black Swordsman, he spent 2 full years cutting down apostles and not caring about collateral damage because he didn't have time to stop and think. But in truth, he also didn't want to think about his actions beyond the satisfaction that they gave him. Before arriving at the Kushan Empire's shores, Guts was struggling with reining in his beast of darkness so much that he let go of it. And this clearly changed what was supposed to happen, because Daiba didn't say it, but he was surprised that Guts didn't resist his soldiers. He told Sealot that a black beast would appear on a wooden horse that gallops across the sea, and he deployed at least a dozen ships to contain said beast. Clearly, he was expecting a battle, and he knew from his previous fight with Guts that he wasn't going to be so easy to restrain. So, when his soldiers simply walked out with him chained up, Daiba knew something had gone awfully wrong, for this wasn't the man who bested him in combat. Somewhere deep down, Guts had lost himself, and to tackle the fight that lay ahead of them, he needed to rediscover who he really was. Was he the Black Swordsman who sacrificed innocent lives to satisfy his own agenda? Or was he Guts, the man who learned how to protect innocence at the cost of his own vendetta? The choice to live one's own life lies in their hands, as Guts has proven time and again to so many people around him. But in this moment, it appears as though he needs to make that call for himself, because he can't remain at the mercy of his despair and malice forever. Like Godot told him shortly before passing away, revenge is a sword you hone by drenching it in blood, but the more blood you put on a blade, the more it rusts, until nothing is left. It was unexpected to hear such wisdom coming from the guy we thought was working on betraying Guts, but leave it to Daiba to do the unexpected. And speaking of blood, whatever decision he implied Guts needs to make is probably going to be shown to us in the next chapter, because chapter 383 was all about setting the stage. Flashbacks that lead to the abyss? Guts sinks. Shortly before the perspective shifted outside the stupa, we saw Guts noticing things that were awfully familiar to him. As he gazed up at the pitch-black ceiling, he observed several drops of primordial ooze forming all around him, and his eyes widened immediately. Not because he isn't the kind to dig slime, but because he has seen this ooze twice before, and neither of those sightings ended in anything even remotely good for the world. The first time we saw blood manifesting in physical orbs was during the Conviction arc, where the Tower of Conviction was swallowed whole by sanguine monsters, leading to Griffith's incarnation in the physical world. The second time was shortly after Casca was kidnapped from Elfhelm, when similar blood blobs emerged and tried to kill anything physical that remained on the island. On both those occasions, one of the most distinctive features of these crimson blobs of death was the presence of eyes, which hinted at some form of sentience at work behind the scenes. But the blood blobs we see in chapter 383 have no such thing. They're eyeless and emerge from every crevice and opening within the stupa, engulfing Guts in a cocoon not unlike the one Griffith was enclosed within during the eclipse. As he stares into nothingness, the water underneath the lotus leaf erupts and takes the rough form of a tree. Guts thinks to himself that his death is finally coming for him, because it doesn't matter what the blob's purpose is. He is a sacrificial offering, marked with the brand that attracted them to him in St. Albion and on Elfhelm in the first place. place. Usually when something like this happens, Guts gets back up and starts slashing things until he's the one thing remaining, but now he doesn't have faith in Dragon Slayer. And even more than that, he doesn't have faith in himself. Finally is the only word we hear coming from his psyche, and considering he said something similar when Rakshas attacked him, it might just be him accepting that his sacrificial ritual is about to be completed. But then he sees something bright peering through a hole in the ceiling, and that hole gets wider and wider until it reveals Griffith and Casca in full armor from their days together in the Band of the Falcon. We've seen Casca being depicted in her old gear a few times after the eclipse, but never Griffith, and with good reason. The very next page shows Guts, his deepest moment of despair, aka the moment when Casca was kidnapped. The irony of Guts' life is that as much as he knows emotion is the death of determination and duty, he's so far gone that he can't help but immerse himself within the former. He keeps having these flashbacks to older days, when things were a lot better for him, and then cutting back to his cruel present, where he just wants to die. The best example of this, perhaps, is when he tries confronting his beast of darkness in chapter 373, and goes to pick up Dragon Slayer, but he sees Griffith perched upon it, in a pose identical to the one he pulled off in their first fight. The Black Swordsman's past, present, and future appear to be merging into one, and after these two visions unfold, our hero sinks. Not metaphorically like he did in his Kushan jail cell where Shirka pulled him out, but literally because the lotus leaf underneath him starts sinking into the pool below, and as Guts' body hits the water, it closes around him like a proper hand. The final scene of chapter 383 depicts Guts free-falling through primordial waters as the narrator asks us what he'll see as he sinks deeper. But we already know half of that answer, don't we? Based on Daiba's description, the inside of the stupa is a location within the astral world, so wherever Guts is being taken has to be in the astral world as well. Considering the fact that his final conscious thoughts were of the good old days and the one thing his strength couldn't prevent from happening, it is possible that this place he's going to would be a lot like the Eclipse dimension, because despair and desire are key to reaching those depths. It was Griffith's deep despair at losing his dream and the desire to regain it that made his Behelit activate, and the sequence of events presented to us in 383 follow the same rough outline. But Griffith had one thing that Guts is missing right now, which is a Behelit. Without the Behelit, it's next to impossible to reach the demonic half of the astral world, because that half is only reserved for the chosen ones. So if he isn't going to see the God Hand or the idea of evil, then where is he headed? The stupa, the lotus leaf, the fact that Daiba tells Silat, this is Guts' moment to self-reflect and choose what happens to him, all point to one thing, that he's about to see whatever lies diametrically opposite to the idea of evil. Now, whether we're right or wrong, we'll have to wait and see. But to say that this chapter ended on one of the most frustrating cliffhangers would be an understatement, because this is what we've been talking about since we first said Berserk is in its endgame. Whoever emerges from the stupa will possess the power to either save the world or destroy it. Otherwise, Silat and Daiba wouldn't be hanging around. Now, which one of those forces Guts chooses to embody comes down to what kind of man he chooses to be. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is peak Berserk. Marvelous verdict. But having said that, it looks like we might have to wait a while before we see exactly where Guts is headed. So until chapter 384 comes out, why don't you let us know your thoughts in the comments below? Like, share, and subscribe to Marvelous Anime for more Berserk content while you're at it. And we will see you guys with updates real soon. Till then, stay safe and keep struggling, strugglers.